Evidence for the Bible being the Word of God, Part 2. And this time we're going to go over the historical evidence for it. So we have exponentially more reason to believe that Jesus Christ existed than almost anybody else in history, if not anybody else in history.
Hey, what's up? I'm Dallas Wade, and welcome back to another worship service.
Evidence for the Bible being the Word of God, Part 2.
Everybody's favorite NFT bro and pyramid scheme runner, Cody Wynn, is back at it again with more evidence for the Bible. Let's just hope that he has better evidence than he did last time.
So last time we went over why a God would be able to create such a book with ease if a God existed like that. And this time we're going to go over the historical evidence for it. So
heck yeah, I love historical evidence. What do you got for us, Cody? Ancient writings from the Egyptians describing how the firstborn son of every home died mysteriously all within the same night? Or journals from the ancient citizens of Jerusalem describing how a bunch of Jewish zombies rose from their graves and hung out with their families? Or did archaeologists find the Ark of the Covenant? That would be pretty awesome. So what do you got for us, Cody? I hope it's something on that level, because that would be spicy.
So generally today we find out whether historical documents were accurate or not by the amount of manuscripts we have of that, which simply means the amount of copies of the original that were created.
That's not really true, though. Just because there are a lot of copies of an old story doesn't mean that that story was actually literally true. It just means that that story was a popular story, not necessarily that it was a historical event. Myths, legends, and fables make up some of the most copied writings of antiquity. So if we actually determined what was true about the past simply by believing whatever document was copied a bunch of times, then we would have to simultaneously believe in Thor and Vishnu, Osiris and Marduk, Zeus and Shang-Ti, along with goblins, fairies, trolls, and talking animals. Let's say hypothetically that in 5,000 years, archaeologists find millions of copies of The Lord of the Rings. Should they then conclude that Frodo, Gandalf, and Gollum were all real people, that orcs, hobbits, and elves were real creatures, and that all of the events of those stories actually occurred? No, absolutely not. That is not how historians should or do determine what happened in the past.
Books like the Quran has around 1,000. That's the second most out of any book ever in existence.
Wait, so if you believe that the Bible is the most reliable document of all time simply because it has the most amount of ancient manuscripts, by that same logic, do you then believe that the Quran is the second most reliable document of all time simply because it has the second most amount of ancient manuscripts? Or do the number of manuscripts not matter when it comes to the Quran or the Iliad? Do they only matter when it comes to the Bible? And if that is the case, then you have a double standard. Because if the Quran can be false while still having a bunch of ancient manuscripts, then so can the Bible.
And people like George Washington, people say, Cody, why do you believe that Jesus was even existing? And I would say, well, why do you believe George Washington did? We have evidence of his existence, and we have exponentially more of Jesus's.
You actually think that we have more evidence that Jesus Christ existed than George Washington? Are you serious? We have actual letters written by George Washington himself that we have preserved and are still intact today, along with a multitude of letters to George Washington or mentioning George Washington, along with freaking newspaper articles from around the world mentioning George Washington and describing his actions, even from his enemies. And on top of all of that, despite not having cameras during that time, we have paintings of George Washington from painters who were painting him while he was sitting right there in front of them. So we even have a pretty good idea of what George Washington looked like from multiple sources. There is an overabundance of evidence that George Washington existed. The same is not true of Jesus. All we have when it comes to Jesus are writings that were written either decades or centuries or a millennia after he allegedly existed. And the overwhelming majority of those, like 99.99%, come from Christians. And I'm not saying that Jesus didn't exist. It's very possible that he did. But if he did, he definitely wasn't as popular or as fantastic as the Gospels describe him as being. The Gospels frequently mention that Jesus was followed by thousands of people around major cities, and they even make it clear that Jesus was well known among the royalty and the elites of that time. And on top of that, they make it explicitly clear that Jesus was performing incredible miracles in front of all of these people. So why did no one ever write about these events outside of the Gospels? People should have been talking about these things and writing about these things as they were happening, but they weren't. So no, we do not have better evidence that Jesus Christ existed than George Washington. It's not even close.
Just in the last about 3/4 of the Bible, which is called the New Testament.
Well, actually, the New Testament makes up only about 23.05% of the Bible, which is slightly less than 1/4, not 3/4.
Just in that part alone, we have over 5,000 manuscripts, which is over 5 times as many as any other book in existence.
Yes, we do have thousands of ancient New Testament manuscripts, but the overwhelming majority of them come almost a millennium after the events they're recording allegedly took place. We have 0 manuscripts from the 1st century. We have 4 manuscript fragments from the 2nd century, which collectively make up about 42 verses. We have roughly 100 manuscripts from the 3rd and 4th century combined, and the rest of the manuscripts come after the 5th century, and the overwhelming majority of those come after the 9th century. And it's also important to keep in mind that most of these manuscripts are just fragments containing a few verses or chapters. So yeah, it's really easy to throw out a big number and it sounds really impressive, especially since most people aren't going to fact check you and they're just going to assume that all of these manuscripts are like the entire Bible from the 1st century or something like that, but that is far, far from the truth. It's always a good idea to fact check people, especially when they're throwing out big numbers or a bunch of numbers, which is something that I just did. So if you'd like to fact check me, I would recommend checking out the Institute for New Testament Textual Research. I believe that they have a website which contains a lot of their information, but they also have this handy little book, and the book also comes with this handy little reference paper right here, which I use all the freaking time. It contains a list of the most consistently cited and the most important New Testament manuscripts, and it also provides an approximate date of when these manuscripts were written, so that's extremely useful to have. This is probably one of my favorite books that I own. I use it all the time when I'm making videos. I think every Christian should own one of these things. It's pretty incredible. And it is a much more reliable source than some random Christian TikToker who's trying to get you to join his pyramid scheme.
Some people say, Cody, your program is too expensive, I can't afford it. That is a broke mentality. That mentality is what keeps people broke. Right now, I own a 7-figure business. I own 2 Teslas. I'm 23 years old. Can't make any bullcrap excuses like your program's too expensive, that's why I can't afford it. If you want generational wealth in your life, stop making excuses.
If you can't give me 10 minutes of your time, you're never going to be able to have success being a business owner.
Right.
So we have exponentially more reason to believe that Jesus Christ existed than almost anybody else in history, if not anybody else in history.
What about Michael Jackson? What about Ronald Reagan? What about Stan Lee? What about Albert Einstein? What about Louis Armstrong? These are all deceased people who now exist exclusively in our history. Is there more evidence for the existence of Jesus than all of them? If you actually believe that, Cody, then you are out of your mind. And if you're going to say, well, duh, of course we have more evidence of their existence because they existed during a time where we have video and audio recording, well, okay then. So why didn't Jesus? If our eternal lives are dependent on whether or not we believe in Jesus and whether or not we live our lives according to his teachings, then why not send him down during an era when we could actually record what he had to say in 4K video and high definition audio? Wouldn't that be better? Wouldn't that save more souls? No one would ever have an excuse to not believe that he existed, and no one would ever have to debate about what he actually said. One of the primary reasons that I don't believe that Jesus was the son of some god is due to the fact that the evidence of his existence is so scarce. It's practically non-existent. And the evidence that he was actually performing miracles and raising people from the dead is absolutely non-existent. And even if he did exist, we don't even know what he actually said. Whoever wrote the Gospels, even if they were eyewitnesses, they were writing down the words of Jesus decades after he actually said them. Do you think that you could write down a speech that you heard 10 years ago? What about 30 years ago? You probably couldn't write down a speech that you heard 3 days ago, maybe even 3 hours ago. So the original New Testament manuscripts probably weren't that accurate to begin with. But just to make matters worse, not only do we not have the original New Testament manuscripts, we don't even have a complete copy of the New Testament until roughly the middle of the 4th century. Codex Sinaiticus is currently the oldest complete copy that we have of the New Testament, and Codex Sinaiticus differs a lot from later manuscripts. Just to name a few examples, references to Jesus being the Son of God in Mark 1:1 and Matthew 24:36 are not present. The Gospel of Mark ends in chapter 16 verse 8 with the women running away in fear and telling no one of what they saw. So in this version, Jesus simply went to heaven and didn't return to visit the apostles or ascend into heaven in front of the crowd of witnesses. The story of the adulterous woman in John 8 is also completely absent, and so is the conclusion of the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6. Luke also doesn't reference the ascension of Jesus in Luke 24, and Luke 9:55 through 56 isn't present either. Also in Mark 1:41 of the Codex Sinaiticus, it describes Jesus being angry, but later manuscripts change that and describe him as being compassionate. So we know for a fact that things were added, removed, and changed in the Gospels even after the 4th century. Fortunately, we have the Codex Sinaiticus, so we have a pretty good idea about what all was changed from that point onward, but unfortunately we don't have the original manuscripts from the 1st century, so from the 1st century to the 2nd, 3rd, and finally until the middle of the 4th century, we have absolutely no idea what all was added, what all was removed, and what all was changed. If our eternal lives supposedly depend on us following the words of Jesus, who is supposedly the Son of God, then why didn't this God think of a better way of having his words recorded? There isn't much of a reason to believe that Jesus existed, if any, and even if he did exist, we don't even know what he said or what he did. But we do know what George Washington said because we literally have letters that he himself wrote. I'm sorry, Cody, but you have yet to prove that the Bible is true. I think you have 7 videos left in your Proving the Bible series, so I hope that in your future videos you provide better arguments than you have so far. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next worship service.